looking at this whole idea of demographics or population, and we're going to look at the definition of population and these sorts of things, and also then look at the effects on an economy of a rise in the population, but with particular emphasis obviously on economic development, although there are questions from earlier in the course on rising population and immigration and emigration. So the first thing that we really need to look at is some definitions, and so we're just going to concentrate here on changes in population. And the population can obviously change for different reasons, the birth rate and the death rate. Now this is an interesting one because obviously when you get an increase in the population and then let's say we have economic development going on, the economic development will actually raise the birth rate usually because you've got better health facilities, and it will obviously then reduce the death rate as well because of better health facilities. So the birth and the death rate can be affected by development, as well as these things affecting the rate of economic development. You can obviously have wars which are going to cause population changes. One in the UK at the moment is this one here of early retirement. A lot of people over the age of 50, 55 have retired when COVID happened, and so the government are trying to get those back into the workforce because they're finding shortages. And immigration and emigration is a big topic from last year, but I just want to point out that some knowledge that you need now is that from the UK's point of view, Brexit caused a lot of workers to go back overseas, European workers, and also so did COVID as they went back to be with their families, and then they haven't come back to the UK. And so because of these two problems here, we are actually having a labour shortage in many areas. So changes in the population can be caused by lots of things. But one of the key things to talk about is the dependency ratio, which is the youth and the elderly, that is those who are not working and those who are not working, to those in the working age group. Because obviously if you have a rise in those who aren't working and a rise in those who live longer, then they're going to be dependent on these, and that's going to cause problems later on. So that's where we get our pension crisis from. So it's not just about the number of people, it's about which category they go into, if you like. And lastly, we need to think about living standards and productivity and make sure that you don't mix these up. Productivity is the output per person that is working. So it's those in the working age group, really. Sometimes they call it output per man hour or output per person. But it's the output for those who are working, whereas living standards gives us the idea of output per head of population. That's all the people in the population. And that's why knowing the dependency ratio is important, because all of the population is in here, but only some of them are actually producing goods and services to increase the living standards of all the population. So hopefully that helps. So let's start to consider what would happen if there is a rise in the population, because this is often given as a question in development economics. Discuss the extent to which a rise in a population is a factor that has hindered economic development, often is the question. So you can either look at it both ways, in fact you must look at it both ways, and then you bring up another issue as well. So the first thing about a population rise is that it's going to affect the aggregate supply in the economy, okay, and so we are going to be, let's move this here, we're going to be looking at aggregate supply. And aggregate supply, if you have a rise in the population, there's going to be more in employment and of the working age is the assumption. In other words, aggregate supply is determined by the quantity of the factors and the productivity of the factors. And so I think you're going to argue here that if there's a rise in population, there's going to be a rise in the quantity of labour in the economy, increasing the ability of the economy to produce goods and services. Now, obviously, you've got to start to think, is it of working age? Are those people coming in? A rise in the population? If it's immigration, are they working age population? If it's just a rise in the population because of good birth rates, then it's going to take some time before the aggregate supply of the economy is going to grow. But also, they're going to affect the aggregate demand. So an increase in population here will affect aggregate demand. Okay, I think it's easier if we see them all together. And so the aggregate demand in the population is also going to rise when there's this increase in the population. And this is often something that they talk about in development economics, where they argue that as a country develops, one of the key things is that there's a growing middle class of consumers who've got the extra jobs, the higher income jobs, but more than that, they're not only adding therefore to supply, but they can actually then afford to buy more goods and services, which increases your economic development, because with both of these rising, you are increasing your GNI, your gross national income, which is part of the HDI index. So that's quite an important one, that when you do this, that you don't just stick at ADAS, but you actually go on to raising real GDP, gross national income per head if you want, and then link that to the index of the HDI, so therefore you link it through to economic development. The next one, which is linked very closely to this really, is productivity. And productivity has been one that people have questioned over time about economic development. And what they argue is that as you get an increase in the population, then in the short run, certainly diminishing returns set in, and maybe in the long run you get diminishing returns to scale as well. So, in other words, the productivity of each worker goes down unless, and this is an important one, the capital stock goes up. So if you are just saying you put more and more workers into jobs, then productivity is going to fall over time, but it does encourage investment in capital goods and services. Now, when it comes to the argument about immigration, the evidence, certainly when you look at it, and you should have looked at this in the first year, is that it tends to raise productivity. You tend to get immigration of skilled workers into your economy, and so immigration has had a positive effect on certainly the UK economy, but that's the subject of another video if you need it. Okay. The next thing is FDI. Obviously, if there's a rise in population, that's one of the attractions of FDI, that, is there enough labour is often what they ask if they want to invest in the country, and a rise in population means that there is, and you need to link it to the quality of the labour. That's why I think population and education skills should really be put together as one whole topic in your thinking. But FDI tends to get attracted when there is this rise in population, because they've got the labour, they've got the quality of labour, the investment comes in. As I said, we need some investment here coming in, and often it's the FDI that brings that investment, which brings a big boost to the productivity of an economy. And also the FDI comes in because there's going to be this big increase in aggregate demand, so the demand in that country is going to be higher as well. So a rise in population, FDI, productivity, you can link those things together if you like. Wages, one of the questions is the increase in the population. It's going to affect wages. In other words, there's going to be an increase in supply, and hence, as a negative, this is going to reduce your wages. But obviously, if you have economic growth up here, then there's an increase in demand, derived demand for employment, and so therefore maybe the wages won't go down that much. Big one in development is that if you get this rise in population, then you need a much bigger social infrastructure. You need health and education facilities, you need housing, you need sanitation and water, etc. All those things that we've talked about before with the infrastructure. And so I think really, this could be the argument as to why the rise in population has hindered development, because it's the development problem of a lack of social infrastructure and also environmental problems as well. But obviously a lack of infrastructure and social infrastructure is your big one. And it's a public sector infrastructure as well that the population needs more housing, more sanitation, more drainage, etc. And so those three there, public sector, environment, and population, could go together. So social infrastructure could go together. And finally, fiscal policy. And the idea here is that as the population rises, you are going to need increased spending, but you will also get increased tax revenue, particularly if there's the increase in aggregate demand and productivity here and economic growth in the long run. Then that's going to bring a fiscal dividend, but there will be the infrastructure spending that's needed, etc., to cope with the rise in population. So hopefully you can see, and that gives you a good indication of some of the problems that are related to population, and the whole question about whether the rise in population is a cause of a lower level of development, mainly because they're talking about these things, and then these things would be the arguments to say, but no, it might actually improve development over here. Okay, now just going to bring in education quickly and look at what are the consequences of having a poor education of these, of the population. And remember, you need to start with remembering from last year that education's a merit good. It's part of the human development in its own, and it has an immediate effect when you increase spending on education, but also an ongoing, a long-run effect. Okay, the effect on the workers themselves is that workers with low skills don't earn as much, and so if you have this education problem, then they're not going to earn as much. It's linked to what we call the marginal revenue product theory, which you'll come to later. But also it means that with the lack of education, you're going to have lower wages, and that's one of the reasons for the savings gap. You have persistent poverty, and higher wages are going to give the ability to buy more goods, and so these workers with a poor education are not going to be able to enjoy being able to buy so many goods, and so that's another reason why poor education does lead to a lack of economic development. It also leads to low levels of productivity, so the long run aggregate supply will only show small rises, makes the country less competitive, and sustainable growth is obviously going to be lower. And the last one, which is an important one, is that the country is unable to move through from a low income to a medium income level of development, and this is known as the Lewis model, which we look at later in another video. But poor education is going to hinder what we call the industrialization of an economy, and this lack of FDI will also be a problem in that if there's not a basic level of education. And so these are the consequences of a poor education in a country that is seeking some economic development. So hopefully with those two ideas of population, sometimes it can be good or bad. but link it in, please, if you can, to educated and skilled population, and that will give you a much better idea.